3 locked drawers, a bundle of decaying letters tied with ribbon blackened by time, and a name repeated through every page like a wound that never healed. Adrian Mercer. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. I never meant to uncover any of this. My intention was only to catalog the Mercer Estate archives, a routine university project, quiet and forgettable. Yet on the second week, hidden behind a false panel in a cedar chest, I found a journal wrapped in oilcloth, dated Memphis, 1851. The pages were dry as brittle leaves, written in the neat, careful hand of Mrs. Eleanor Mercer, widow of a once prominent cotton merchant. The first entry chilled me for reasons I didn't then understand. I will not allow what was done to Adrian to be erased. They will answer, all of them. The name was unfamiliar then. It would soon haunt me. Her next pages spoke of 3 families, bound by wealth yet rotting underneath it: the Whitlocks, the Davenport brothers, and the Mercers themselves. Men respected in public, terrified in private. A transaction was hinted at, something purchased that should never have been bought. Adrian was the axis on which every life would eventually crack. The date August 3rd, 1851 appears like a starting gun. They displayed him as though he were livestock. A boy of 17, brilliant, beautiful, born free by every certificate I possess. And still they traded him. My breath caught when I read that line the first time. I turned the page slowly. She wrote of whispers through parlors thick with tobacco and prejudice, of a price so obscene it could have purchased a fleet of riverboats, of how the 3 families each claimed rights to Adrian, as though humanity could be divided like land. And hidden between the sentences fear. Eleanor's recollection was calm, almost clinical, yet beneath it ran a pulse of rage sharpened over months. She documented meetings, receipts, statements in ledger margins, names of lawyers, ship manifests. It wasn't grief, not entirely. It was preparation. The final paragraph of entry 1 ended abruptly, leaving more unsaid than written. When they took Adrian from me, I swore I would see every man who profited from him brought low, whether by law, by public shame, or by their own conscience. I have nothing left to lose. The page after that was blank, as if she paused or hesitated or wept. What happened next, as the journal revealed piece by piece, would fracture Memphis society for decades. Lives ruined, reputations scorched beyond recognition. Suicide, mysterious death, a disappearance that never resolved cleanly in any official record. All of it stemming from this single theft, not of property, but of a person. And I warn you now, the deeper the pages go, the more the handwriting shakes, as though Eleanor herself was being watched, even as she documented the truth. Eleanor's second entry began 12 days later, the handwriting tighter, strained. The tone shifted, no longer a grieving mother, but a strategist taking inventory of her enemy. Adrian was moved again last night. They believe secrecy will save them. Fools. The city has eyes they do not see. The Whitlocks, she recorded, were keeping Adrian temporarily on their river property, a grand house framed by sycamore trees and guarded slaves who pretended not to watch. Mr. Whitlock had insisted the boy was a business acquisition, a phrase Eleanor underlined 3 times, as though the ink itself were a blade. Rumors had already begun spreading through parlors and dining halls, nothing clear, only whispers that the Whitlocks had acquired a specimen. No one spoke Adrian's name publicly, but everyone knew something was different this time. Too much money had changed hands. Too many men stared over their cups with hunger and calculation. Eleanor wrote that Mrs. Whitlock refused to set foot in the house while Adrian remained there. The staff reported she slept at her sister's, claiming migraines, though servants swore she wept through the walls. The Davenport brothers, crueler, younger, drunker, wanted Adrian for labor. For them it was sport, ownership a matter of ego. They visited the Whitlock estate 3 nights in a row, pressing for transfer, each time returning furious. Eleanor noted every detail. Samuel Davenport struck a servant boy for failing to bring his horse fast enough. He raged for the rest of the evening. His brother kept smiling. The Mercers, Eleanor's own family, stood between the two factions. Her late husband's lingering debts gave the Whitlocks leverage over them, and the Davenports held half the cotton contracts for that year. Eleanor, though in mourning black, attended dinners, smiled where expected, and listened. She described how gentlemen laughed too loudly when Adrian's name nearly surfaced, how eyes darted like mice in torchlight, how certain wives avoided speaking of him at all, as though silence itself might erase the stain. But the pages grew darker. I visited the estate under pretense of returning Mr. Whitlock's ledger. They allowed me inside. Adrian saw me. He did not speak. His gaze followed me like a boy drowning beneath ice. She wrote of his posture, thin shoulders, wrists marked as if recently bound. Not beaten, not yet, but handled, displayed. A guest showed him off like one might show a rare horse. Eleanor left without breaking. That night she wrote a list titled Those Who Must Answer. Under it 9 names. Some crossed out later. Others circled until the paper tore. The final passage of Part 2 chilled more than any threat could. They think they control this. They think I am powerless because I am a woman alone. They forget I am a mother first. I will gather proof. I will wait. Men in Memphis fear scandal more than sin. When the truth comes, it will not knock, it will burn. Outside the margin, in faded pencil, someone perhaps years later added, "She was right." The morning sun had barely touched the rooftops of Memphis when Eleanor Thornton's network began moving. Her instructions, precise and coded, flowed through invisible channels, letters tucked in hollow, out books, notes slipped under innkeeper doors, trusted couriers disguised as delivery boys. Every message carried a single directive: observe, record, report. By this time, Marcus, now fully aware of his own leverage, was an active participant. Eleanor's entries described his growing intelligence and determination. Marcus understands the gravity. He listens, asks questions, and notes every transaction, every conversation. He smiles at their arrogance, not in joy, but in calculation. At the Whitlock estate, tension ran like electricity beneath polished floors. The men believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their wealth insulated them from consequences. The Davenports pressed harder, threatening litigation and public exposure over financial entanglements, all while oblivious to the silent observer in the corner, Marcus. Eleanor documented each detail meticulously: the times of day each visitor arrived, and the order in which rooms were entered. Specific phrasing used in contracts, letters, and ledgers, often marking discrepancies that could suggest fraud. The sleeping arrangements, how Marcus was moved to different rooms depending on guests. How each male head of household discussed him openly, forgetting a boy's eyes could pierce their calculated facades. Every entry painted a picture not only of oppression, but of strategic advantage. Eleanor wrote about a narrow corridor in the Whitlock property, a passage used only by servants, where Marcus could overhear whispered plans of trade and manipulation. Knowledge is leverage. He now holds keys to their empires, unseen and unheard. When the moment comes, it will be devastating. Eleanor herself ventured into public spaces under the guise of mourning, speaking softly to allies who were instructed to report back details from ballrooms, port docks, and city halls. Even merchants unaware of her full plan became unwitting informants. By the end of Part 3, the city had begun to stir with rumors subtle at first, then increasingly pointed. Observers in parlors whispered of strange comings and goings at the Whitlocks and Davenports' homes. Notes, and letters started to surface mysteriously, always hinting at hidden crimes and the consequences of greed. They believe their silence protects them, Elena wrote, but silence is a shield only until someone chooses to shatter it. The first fracture is always the most telling. In those weeks, Marcus and Elena became a dual force. She the strategist, he the operative. Both understood that time was a weapon, and that the missteps of Memphis's elite were as predictable as they were inevitable. As Part 3 closes, the stage is set for confrontation. The city, blind to the invisible hand guiding events, continues its daily routines, unaware that the undercurrents of justice, methodical, merciless, and ingenious, are about to sweep through its wealthiest homes, dismantling carefully constructed facades and exposing the fragility of power built on exploitation. By the time February's chill settled over Memphis, the city's elite had begun to feel a creeping unease. No one knew precisely what was coming, but subtle disruptions hinted that their carefully curated world was beginning to unravel. Letters arrived anonymously, ledger entries were inexplicably missing, and whispered rumors of misdeeds found their way into parlors and offices alike. Marcus Thornton, once a silent observer, had transformed. No longer the passive servant, he moved with purpose, guided by Elena's meticulous instructions. Each day, he gathered intelligence, mapping the vulnerabilities of the families who had sought to exploit him. Every transaction, every conversation, every indiscretion counts. Elena wrote in one of her now thick journals, "He must know everything they take for granted." The first real fracture came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but its consequences would ripple outward like a shockwave. Thomas Dalton, the eldest son of the Dalton family, collapsed unexpectedly in his chamber. Though doctors claimed a sudden seizure, Elena had anticipated the psychological strain her revelations would place on those who had trafficked her son. She knew guilt could destroy a man just as surely as poverty or scandal. At the Harrington estate, tension between Edmund and Charles reached a new height. Edmund had long justified his actions as lawful and profitable, but Marcus's disappearance and Elena's machinations forced him to confront the moral consequences he had ignored. Charles, watching his father struggle, felt a mixture of fear and reluctant admiration for Elena's precision. Every detail of their household, previously taken for granted, now seemed fragile and exposed. Richard and Victoria Keendish were equally unsettled. The burned warehouse had been only the first signal that their world was vulnerable. Now, private investigators hired to locate Marcus returned with fragmented reports, houses emptied days before searches, faint trails that led nowhere, and a single, unnerving certainty. Marcus and his mother were always one step ahead. Victoria's temper, once a weapon, now flared with desperation, while Richard's burns and injuries compounded his fear, leaving him physically weakened yet still defiant. The invisible hand of Eleanor's strategy extended into the city's public sphere as well. She orchestrated subtle disruptions, financial transfers that caused temporary panic among merchants, hints of scandals whispered into the right ears, and documents left in strategically visible places to ensure that the perception of power shifted. The families, isolated and suspicious of one another, began to question their allies as much as their enemies. Divide and conquer. Elena noted in her journal, "They are strongest together. Once fractured, their wealth, their influence, their sense of security, all crumble." By the end of Part 4, Memphis was changing. The elite were no longer in control. Uncertainty reigned. Marcus, trained by circumstance and guided by his mother, had become a linchpin in a plan that threatened everything the Harringtons, Daltons, and Keendishes had built. What had begun as a silent operation of observation had turned into a precise, inexorable dismantling of power, with Eleanor Thornton orchestrating each move from the shadows. The stage was set for the next phase, confrontation. The family's desperation would lead them to choices that exposed not just their wealth, but the very morality upon which their lives were built. Marcus, once seen as property, had become the catalyst for justice, a force they had never anticipated and could not contain. By mid-February, the tension in Memphis had become palpable. Whispers of Marcus Thornton's disappearance, the mysterious fire at the Keendish warehouse, and Thomas Dalton's sudden death had begun circulating through the city's elite like wildfire. Every merchant, lawyer, and socialite sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding, but no one could identify the source or the end game. Within the Harrington estate, Edmund wrestled with fear and guilt in equal measure. Each morning brought a fresh wave of dread. He no longer slept soundly. Shadows seemed to linger in corners where his children once played. Charles observed his father with quiet apprehension, understanding that their world, built on centuries of privilege and unquestioned assumptions, was slowly unraveling. Eleanor Thornton's plan advanced with a precision that bordered on ruthless artistry. Marcus, once considered a passive pawn, now moved with the confidence of someone who knew the city's hidden avenues better than the men who thought they controlled it. He had gathered correspondence, memorized accounts, and learned the habits of those who had sought to use him for profit. Every detail of their lives, their greed, their lies, their moral compromises, was catalogued in his mind. Richard and Victoria Keendish, frustrated by the lack of progress in locating Marcus, doubled down on their efforts. Private investigators, slave catchers, and hired informants scoured the countryside, yet all efforts returned with the same unnerving conclusion. Marcus was always ahead. Victoria's rage became a constant hum, erupting in the household over trivial missteps, while Richard's physical recovery did little to calm his growing paranoia. He began to suspect that each unsuccessful search was no accident, that someone was deliberately misleading them. Meanwhile, the Dalton family teetered on the edge of ruin. Jacob Dalton, grief-stricken, and Gil Tridden began to withdraw from business entirely. The loss of his eldest son had left a void that money and influence could not fill. Rumors spread through Memphis of internal family disputes and financial instability, further weakening their once stalwart reputation. The Thornton mother and son duo remained elusive, but their influence extended far beyond simple escape or evasion. Eleanor began planting subtle, carefully timed revelations of the family's wrongdoings. Bankers noticed discrepancies in the Harrington ledgers. Merchants whispered about Keendish's questionable deals. Distant relatives of the Daltons murmured about illicit transactions. Eleanor's reach was methodical, ensuring that her hand remained invisible while her power became undeniable. Within the Harrington estate, Charles felt the full weight of the moral reckoning. He had once rationalized slavery as a necessary institution, a business transaction, a societal expectation. But Marcus's intelligence, resilience, and eventual defiance had forced him to confront the human cost. Every calculated move by Eleanor and Marcus highlighted not just their own cunning, but the consequences of a system that reduced humans to commodities. By the close of Part 5, Memphis's social hierarchy had begun to shift. Fear and uncertainty crept into the grand parlors and offices of the elite, leaving a sense of vulnerability that had never existed before. The Thornton strategy was no longer abstract. It was tangible, a force that demanded action and reflection. The city, accustomed to the quiet domination of a few powerful families, had become a chessboard with Eleanor and Marcus as the unseen players moving pieces with precision. And yet, the most dramatic twists were still to come. The families, cornered and desperate, would soon confront the reality that no amount of wealth, influence, or violence could undo the reckoning Eleanor had set in motion. Marcus Thornton, once a commodity, had become the catalyst for their downfall, and the harbinger of justice they had never imagined. By late February, the desperation in Memphis had reached a fever pitch. The three families, once bastions of wealth and influence, now operated in a state of constant unease. Every letter, every visitor, and every unusual sound seemed to carry the potential for catastrophe. The absence of Marcus Thornton and the unrelenting presence of Eleanor Thornton's unseen hand had upended the careful equilibrium they had relied upon for generations. Richard and Victoria Keendish escalated their efforts with alarming intensity. The private investigators they had hired began reporting increasingly disturbing findings. Traces of Marcus in neighboring towns, cryptic letters hinting at his mother's strategy, and patterns of movement that suggested Eleanor had anticipated every attempt at tracking them. Victoria, her calm veneer replaced by a ferocious determination, insisted that no expense or action be spared. "If we do not find them," she said, pacing her drawing room, "our families will be ruined. They must pay for daring to challenge us." Richard nodded silently, though every furrowed line in his brow betrayed his mounting fear. Edmund Harrington, by contrast, found himself paralyzed between two worlds. Part of him understood the moral justice in Eleanor's demands, the freeing of his household slaves, the restitution, the dismantling of the very structures that had enabled cruelty. Another part, the part that had been molded by privilege, feared the financial and social annihilation that compliance would bring. Charles watched his father with growing concern, recognizing that hesitation could now cost lives. Meanwhile, Eleanor Thornton remained an enigma. Reports from intermediaries suggested she had mobilized trusted allies, individuals with a deep understanding of legal loopholes, travel networks, and underground routes. Marcus had grown into a partner, not a mere subject. He carried intelligence with him, negotiating the terrain with a confidence that unsettled even the most seasoned trackers. Every attempt by the families to predict their movements failed. Each man they sent seemed to encounter nothing but shadows. Jacob Dalton's despair had already led to inaction, but now his family's remaining assets teetered on the brink. Creditors whispered of insolvency. Employees and associates avoided engagement, fearing entanglement with scandal. The Daltons were beginning to crumble from within, a silent collapse amplified by the deeds of Eleanor and Marcus. Within the Harrington household, the atmosphere was suffocating. Charles could no longer reconcile the lessons of his upbringing with the moral imperative the Thorntons had forced upon him. Each conversation with his father revealed a tension between conscience and survival, ethics and expedience. Edmund's private moments of reflection were haunted by the realization that, no matter the outcome, the choices they had made would leave permanent scars. As the deadline imposed by Eleanor loomed, the family's responses grew more extreme. Richard and Victoria contemplated hiring men capable of violence, plotting preemptive strikes to eliminate the threat. Edmund considered last-minute negotiations, drafting carefully worded communications meant to appease without fully surrendering. Charles, meanwhile, wrestled with the idea that true resolution might require an acceptance of accountability, no matter the cost. The city of Memphis watched silently, oblivious to the unseen chessboard playing out in its shadows. Power, influence, and greed were colliding with cunning, morality, and vengeance. Marcus Thornton and Eleanor Thornton had not merely vanished. They had seized control of a story that would forever alter the fate of those who sought to control them. By the end of Part 6, the families were trapped between fear and pride, their choices narrowing as the Thorntons' plans reached a climax. The stage was set for confrontation, not merely of wealth or influence, but of conscience and justice, in a world that had long preferred silence over morality. By early March, the Thorntons' shadow over Memphis had grown nearly tangible. Each day brought fresh reports to the Harringtons, Keendishes, and Daltons, trails traced and then lost, cryptic letters, glimpses of Marcus moving through distant towns, and subtle, almost imperceptible signs that Eleanor had eyes everywhere. No corner of the city, no routine of the elite families, remained untouched. The sense of being watched, of power slipping through their fingers, gnawed at them relentlessly. Edmund Harrington had finally resolved to act. With 20 days remaining before Eleanor's deadline, he sent a carefully worded message requesting a private meeting. It was a delicate gamble. Appeal to her sense of justice, demonstrate willingness to comply, and hope that mercy could coexist with restitution. Charles accompanied his father, armed not with guns or wealth, but with honesty and a silent hope that reason might prevail where greed and fear had failed. The meeting was set in a small, abandoned church just beyond the outskirts of Memphis. The building was eerily quiet, the pews coated with dust, and the sunlight filtering through stained glass casting fractured colors across the floor. Eleanor Thornton waited, poised and composed, her presence commanding the empty sanctuary. Marcus stood beside her, no longer a child hidden in the shadows, but a young man whose intelligence, experience, and resolve radiated authority. "Mr. Harrington," Eleanor said, her voice precise, "thank you for coming. I trust recent events have clarified the urgency of your situation." Edmund's throat was dry. "Yes," he admitted, "your demands. They would dismantle my family. I am willing to take responsibility for my actions to provide restitution, and I ask you to spare my wife, my son, and those who depend on our household." Eleanor's gaze was unyielding. "Innocent lives. You speak of mercy now, when you caused irreparable harm to my son. Where was your mercy then?" Edmund's shoulders slumped. "I was wrong. I participated because it was profitable, legal, convenient. I am not asking for forgiveness. I ask only that you allow consequences to fall on me." There was a pause. Eleanor studied him with the weight of history and grief. Then, unexpectedly, her expression softened. "Your son spoke for compliance at your meeting with the other families. Honesty, true honesty, was his choice. It has merit." Charles felt the attention shift to him. I only spoke what I thought right," he admitted, "whether I fully believed it or not. I don't know any more. I've witnessed Marcus, and it has shown me the error of my upbringing." Eleanor nodded once, decisively. "Then here are my revised terms. You will free your household slaves, provide documentation and support for their new lives, and resign from the bank boards. I will not require public acknowledgement of your role in purchasing Marcus. My documentation remains sealed. You may rebuild. The diminished, you will not be destroyed." "And Marcus?" Charles asked. Marcus spoke, calm and resolute. "I am going north to Boston. My mother has contacts. I will study law, help others caught in systems like the one that enslaved me. This is not forgiveness. It is survival and purpose." Edmund exhaled, a mixture of relief and sorrow. The impossible choices of the past months had been resolved, not through wealth or violence, but through the reckoning of conscience and the strategic intelligence of a mother protecting her child. As the Thorntons departed, the Harringtons began the painstaking process of dismantling the foundations of their wealth and privilege. Memphis would remember the scandal, but the Thorntons' vengeance had been precise, measured, and morally exacting. Marcus had survived, Eleanor had triumphed, and the families were left to reckon with their own complicity. Lesson far deeper and more permanent than any public disgrace could impart. In the months that followed Marcus Thornton's escape and Eleanor Thornton's carefully orchestrated reckoning, Memphis simmered with rumors. The city's elite whispered in hushed tones about the sudden misfortunes that had befallen the Harringtons, Daltons, and Keendishes. Official records noted bankruptcies, mysterious deaths, and social withdrawals, but the full story remained obscured. Eleanor had ensured that the truth, her meticulous documentation, remained safely in her hands, ready to be revealed only if necessary. The Harringtons bore the brunt of the scandal with a reluctant grace. Edmund freed all 16 of his household slaves, providing each with legal documentation, funds, and assistance to begin new lives. The process was laborious and painful, dismantling decades of wealth and social standing. Charles assisted in the transition, experiencing firsthand the profound human cost of the system he had been raised to accept. Slowly, the Harrington name shifted from one of unquestioned prominence to a quieter, morally reflective tier of society. They retained some measure of respect, but the aura of untouchable power had vanished. Jacob Dalton's tragic suicide had triggered a cascade of scrutiny over his business dealings. Creditors seized his assets, revealing hidden irregularities in the family's finances. The Dalton family scattered, some relocating to other cities, others vanishing into obscurity, their name tainted by scandal and shame. The once prominent household became a cautionary tale, whispered about in business circles as an example of pride, greed, and the destructive weight of concealed wrongdoing. Richard and Victoria Keendish's fate was even harsher. Their determination to resist Eleanor's demands, to confront her through force and intimidation, had backfired catastrophically. Richard's death, suspicious yet conveniently explained away, left Victoria to face mounting investigations alone. She struggled to protect what remained of her family's reputation, but she ultimately failed, dying in poverty in New Orleans just 4 years later. Their ambition and pride had been their undoing, a stark contrast to the Harringtons' painful but morally aligned compliance. As for Marcus Thornton, historical records grow sparse after 1852, reflecting the careful planning and protection orchestrated by his mother. Hints suggest that a man matching his description practiced law in Boston during the 1860s and may have been involved with underground railroad activities, helping others escape the oppression he had once suffered. Marcus had transformed his suffering into purpose, turning the legacy of injustice he endured into a force for advocacy and change. Eleanor Thornton spent her remaining years in Philadelphia, dedicated to charitable work supporting former slaves. She died in 1859, remembered as a widow and mother who had courageously and meticulously ensured justice for her son. Her actions demonstrated a meticulous combination of strategic intelligence, moral clarity, and maternal devotion. The saga of Marcus Thornton and the 3 families who sought to control him illustrates the brutal commodification of human lives before the Civil War. Wealth, beauty, and social ambition collided with conscience, resulting in a high-stakes game that left some dead, some diminished, and one young man free and empowered. Though the specifics of the case faded into obscurity, the story endures as a testament to the consequences of greed and the enduring power of courage, strategy, and moral conviction. Memphis moved on as cities do, but for those involved, and for the generations who would study the case. The events of 1851-1852 remained a permanent reminder. Human life cannot be reduced to property without peril, and justice, even delayed or disguised, can find its own exacting way. Years passed, and the city of Memphis slowly forgot the scandal that had rocked its most powerful families. Gossip faded, newspapers archived, and social memories blurred. Yet for those who had lived through the events of 1851-1852, the consequences remained vivid, a permanent scar left by ambition, greed, and the unforeseen consequences of treating humans as property. The Harringtons, though diminished in social standing, retained a measure of moral and legal survival. Freed from the need to maintain wealth built on the suffering of others, Edmund and Charles began rebuilding their lives in a quieter, humbler way. Their former household slaves, now free, had begun establishing new identities, moving north, marrying, and seeking education. Some correspondence suggests that several became involved in early abolitionist movements, perhaps even crossing paths with Marcus Thornton, whose influence would extend beyond the personal to the societal. The Harringtons' compliance had spared them from complete ruin, but the weight of guilt and the public knowledge of their prior misdeeds lingered like a shadow over their daily lives. Marcus Thornton's life after Memphis remains partially obscured by time and discretion, a reflection of the careful planning that ensured his safety. Accounts hint at a young man, educated, practicing law in Boston, and participating in clandestine activities to aid other escaped slaves. His mother's meticulous orchestration had not only secured his freedom, but had set him on a path to transform his trauma into a mission of justice. In many ways, Marcus became a living testament to resilience and intellect overcoming oppression. The Dalton family's collapse was swift and unforgiving. Jacob Dalton's suicide revealed financial mismanagement, prompting creditors to seize assets and scattering the remaining family members to distant cities. Their name became synonymous with scandal, a cautionary tale of moral failure compounded by desperation. The Kindish family's tragedy was equally stark. Richard's death under suspicious circumstances, Victoria's ultimate demise in poverty, and the exposure of decades of unethical business dealings left them unable to recover. Unlike the Harringtons, who survived through reluctant moral compliance, the Kindishes and Daltons were undone by pride and defiance. Eleanor Thornton's death in 1859 marked the end of a remarkable life dedicated to justice and moral retribution. Her legacy, however, lived on, not only in her son, but in the meticulous records she had kept, which likely survive in private collections or archives. Her strategic mind, unwavering moral clarity, and maternal devotion had overturned a system designed to exploit and dehumanize. Her story remained a testament to the fact that courage, intelligence, and persistence could challenge entrenched power, even in a society that valued wealth over humanity. The tale of Marcus Thornton and the families who sought to control him is more than a historical curiosity. It serves as a window into the moral and social complexities of pre-Civil War America, a reminder of the human cost of commodification, and a reflection on the consequences of prioritizing profit over conscience. It is a story that resonates beyond its time, highlighting questions still relevant today. Who decides a person's value? What are we willing to sacrifice for wealth or status? And how far will courage, intelligence, and moral integrity go in the face of entrenched power? In the end, Marcus Thornton's escape, Eleanor's meticulous orchestration, and the downfall of those who sought to control him reveal a timeless truth. Justice, strategy, and moral courage can prevail, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The events of 1851-1852 may have faded from public memory, but the lessons endure, echoing through history as a testament to the resilience of human dignity against oppression. The story of Marcus Thornton and the chaos that enveloped Memphis in 1851-1852 offers more than a historical mystery. It serves as a profound lesson about human nature, morality, and the structures of power. The lives of the Harringtons, Daltons, and Keendishes were forever altered, not by war or natural disaster, but by the consequences of their own choices, compounded by the extraordinary determination of one mother and her son. For Charles Harrington, the events had been a personal awakening. He had grown up steeped in the values of property, profit, and social hierarchy. To him, Marcus had been a beautiful commodity, an asset to display and exploit. But through observation, conversation, and witnessing his mother's relentless pursuit of justice, Marcus became more than property. He became a symbol of human dignity denied and reclaimed. Charles' moral awakening, arguably slower than Eleanor Thornton's methodical justice, illustrates the tension between inherited privilege and personal conscience. By the end, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Complicity in injustice cannot be undone through silence or avoidance. Edmund Harrington's compliance, though costly, was a testament to moral pragmatism. He chose responsibility over pride, choosing to dismantle the structures that had enriched his family at the expense of others. In doing so, he preserved some measure of life for those dependent on his household, illustrating that ethical choice does not always come without sacrifice, but can still mitigate harm. The Harringtons' subsequent decades were quieter, more humble, but grounded in a newfound moral awareness, a fragile redemption forged through acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The Dalton and Keendish families' refusal to bend to justice illustrates the peril of pride and moral arrogance. Dalton's suicide and Keendish's mysterious death demonstrate the consequences of ignoring responsibility when confronted with irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing. Their downfall was swift and total, a stark contrast to the Harringtons' painful but measured survival. History would remember their names in whispers, often as cautionary tales about the dangers of unbridled ambition, greed, and moral blindness. Marcus Thornton's story, finally free from the chains of Memphis society, embodies resilience, intelligence, and the transformative power of justice. Under the guidance and protection of his mother, he moved north, establishing a new life, using his experience to protect others from the injustices he had endured. While the historical record becomes faint, the hints of his legal practice and involvement in abolitionist causes suggest a life committed to advocacy, a stark and inspiring counterpoint to the cruelty he had survived. Eleanor Thornton's meticulous orchestration of events ensured that justice was served without public spectacle, but the impact of her strategy resonates far beyond her lifetime. Her actions illustrate how courage, intellect, and moral clarity can challenge entrenched systems of power, even in the face of overwhelming odds. She became a quiet architect of accountability, ensuring that the wrongdoing of the powerful did not go unchecked, and that the innocence of victims like her son could be restored. Ultimately, the story of Marcus Thornton and the families who sought to control him is not just a historical account. It is a mirror reflecting the consequences of human choices. It challenges us to ask, how do we measure the value of a human life? What are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of power or wealth? And most importantly, can courage and conscience triumph over greed and cruelty? In remembering this tale, we preserve the lesson that justice, integrity, and moral courage can endure, even in a world designed to suppress them.